1. Homecoming. It felt like the worst of sins at that moment, and Xander Stryker had more than his fair share of experiences in the realm of sin. It was, after all, practically the family business. Less than 16 hours earlier, he'd still been naked on the night-bathed beach of a private island that his colleagues had managed to secure for him. For them. Because he hadn't been the only one naked on that island, wouldn't have even been naked if not for his company forcing him to abandon any and all clothing the moment they had arrived there. A full week of nudity and peace and beauty on a paradise all their own. If it had been possible to get closer to the Garden of Eden in the here and now, Xander would have kept his guns handy for defense against any whispering snakes. Besides, there was a strong likelihood that, were it real and the story surrounding it true, Eden wouldn't be open for vampires to visit. But after the hell that he and his company had been through before getting there, a pseudo-biblical paradise and some mandatory nudity was exactly what they needed. What had taken place on that island, however, was evidence enough that any resemblance that island might have held to the legendary origin of man stopped solely on appearances. Between their pent-up aggressions, delayed desires, and more than just a few gifts tailored to guide their moral compasses as far from reserved as possible, they turned their week on that island into their own personal mission to tempt any god that may be watching to try to cast them away. They'd both faced worse, and woe be unto the deity who tried to delay their well-deserved honeymoon any further. Finally married, and finally free to enjoy that fact, Xander and Estella Stryker made that island theirs. If there was a grain of sand or a palm leaf that hadn't witnessed their passion, hadn't been in some way impacted by their explosive unions, then it had not been for a lack of trying. It had been enough to draw Xander's ordinarily pessimistic and paranoid mind away from its own nature for a no-doubt record-breaking 173 hours. This, Estella teased him, was nothing short of a miracle, if not one ordained by God. At that point, she'd reminded him that the plane would be arriving to take them home and that, though she wasn't against giving the incoming pilots a show, it would probably be in their and their modesty's better interest to get dressed. Less than 16 hours earlier. It was a surreal thought that such a short time ago, he'd been naked and happy and carefree with his wife. How what had been less than a day could feel like a lifetime. The clothes had come back on, and, as though they were part of the outfit, the worries and demands came flooding back. Everything he'd spent that week forgetting about, leaving buried in the darkest recesses of his mind while he basked in the glow of his enchanting bride, was upon him and racking his brain with every bit the merciless savagery it had in the first place. 1 week of making love to Estella, his Estella Stryker, on their own private paradise, and, less than 16 hours later, he was standing at the gates to the Trappist clan's mansion and preparing to dive back into his life of blood and horror and chaos. And that, despite all the debauchery of the past week, felt like the worst of sins at that moment. Especially since his first order of business was to bust in the teeth of one of his closest friends. For the moment, however, he resigned to simply staring up at the headquarters for the clan that he was expected to be the leader of, feeling a strange mixture of resentment and pride and uncertainty welling up within him. On any other day, he wouldn't have been certain what to make of any one of those emotions, and would very likely vent whichever it was with what he did best, making bad things dead. All those emotions at once, however, with no real target to project them on, turned his otherwise laser-sighted aggressions inward, and he found himself once again mourning those who would no longer be occupying the Trappist clan's mansion. And that thought alone was enough to break the hypnotic trance and push him to take the first step towards the mansion. The next step came easier, and every following step even more so, until he was practically sprinting for the double doors. "Xander," Estella's voice chimed in his head, and a moment later, she was beside him, taking his hand into her own, as she gave him an understanding, albeit stern, look. "Don't make it ugly." He smirked at that, realizing that his wife, though not likely thrilled with what he planned to do, wasn't about to try to stop him. In many ways, he supposed, she would have liked to contribute to the violence, but while she had advanced quite a bit from the meek human witch who would go into sobbing hysterics at the sight of roadkill, she was still a long ways from indulging in the pain of others. "Besides," she said on the plane as Xander had vocalized his growing intentions, "I'm sure you'll give him a toe stomp or something on my behalf." Though there was no point of toe stomping on the resume of Xander's history of butt kicking, he couldn't help but find the idea an appealing, if not entirely futile, one. He could see it playing out in his mind just as he had plenty of other times in the past. He'd throw out his aura, twin tendrils of red and black bioelectric fury forking out ahead of him, and throw the doors open as he sprinted up the steps two at a time. The impact of the dual doors slamming open would capture the attention of all within earshot, and there, with an audience of his clan's warriors and initiates, he'd bellow out his target's name like an alpha lion roaring out across the savannah. And then the toe-stomping will commence? Estella's words chimed in his head, giving away that she'd been reading his thoughts. Xander couldn't help himself. The laughter caught him off guard like a punch to the guts, and every choreographed moment he dedicated himself to vanished in an instant as his outstretched aura fizzled and withdrew back into his chest. Still trying to take the steps two at a time, his toe caught one of the corners and he tumbled forward, his own momentum working against him and sending him headlong towards the still closed set of double doors. Seeing this, Estella extended her own aura and opened the doors before he could impact with them, and without the waiting surface to catch him, he finally lost his footing and fell, rolling past the threshold and coming to rest on his back inside the mansion, still in the throes of laughter. Though he'd been hoping for a more flattering entrance, the intent to catch the mansion's occupants off guard and startle them with their leader's dramatic return was still met. And, lucky him, he had a much larger audience to witness the folly. More eyes than Xander was even willing to try to count fell upon him, as the auric shield that had been hiding them from his mind's eye moments earlier lifted. A banner hanging from the far wall that read, "Congratulations, Xander and Estella," fluttered with the combined air current from the open doors and the wave of auric energy that swept through the room, serving as the only source of sound in the otherwise silent mansion. "Certainly one way to make an entrance, though you kinda botched the landing," Stan said with a chuckle as he closed the distance and held out a hand to help Xander up. "And since when do you laugh?" Xander groaned, unable to recapture his anger after such a display, and begrudgingly accepted his friend's offer to help him up. "You can thank Estella for that," he nodded back to his wife, who was still giggling at the series of events as she stepped inside and gasped at the welcome party awaiting them. "And while you're at it," he continued in thought speak to avoid hindering the reawakening festivities all over again, "you can thank her for saving your tail just now." Stan nodded, and if anybody else noticed his solemn face, it didn't stop the room from exploding into a roar of chatter and excitement as Estella began making the rounds to thank everyone for the surprise. "You organized this?" Xander asked, looking around. His drinks and appetizers began getting passed around, and the sound system set throughout the mansion came alive with the thrum of dance music. Stan nodded and shrugged. "What?" he challenged. "You thought I just did parlor tricks and horror shows?" Xander shook his head and sighed. "I had enough of both a week ago," he admitted. Another nod from Stan. Listen, he kept his voice low, but didn't bother to return to thought speak. Xander knew that it didn't matter either way. If Stan didn't want them to be heard, they wouldn't be. Well, I'm glad you're not trying to bust my ribcage with your knee while keeping me pinned to the wall in a chokehold, Xander scowled as his exact plans were recited back to him. I can't say I blame you for wanting to. That said, could I interest you in a non-violent alternative? I know that sort of thing, he gave a gentle nod toward the rest of the party, isn't exactly your thing, so we can duck out without anybody noticing. You've got questions, I know, and it'll be easier to give you the answers with everyone else oblivious to the fact that their fearless leader has already jumped back into business. Xander frowned at that and asked, why set all this up and then just let me sneak off to discuss the moment we arrive? I set this all up, Stan spoke slowly, as though he was explaining a simple concept to a child that didn't understand, because I knew you'd want to sneak off to discuss this the moment you arrived. He glanced back at the party and shook his head. They're your people, Xander, your clan. Their leader just got married and is fresh from his honeymoon with his lovely bride. They want you to celebrate, but more importantly, they want to see you celebrate. They might not understand the brooding introvert they answer to, but this, he motioned to the party again, is what they need. Offering a slight smirk, he patted Xander on the shoulder. But it's not what you need, so you tell Estella that we're going to handle this non-violently. You know she'll appreciate that inclusion, and let her handle the clan. He paused then to retrieve his coat, an unsettling act since he reached through a nearby wall with a casual gesture, as if it were a closet to do it, and started for the door. She's more charming than you, anyway. Xander stared after him a moment before glancing at all the others, already shaking his head. But this is all to celebrate our marriage, he pointed out. Stan paused and glanced back at that. And Xander blinked at the response, uncertain of how his confusion could be brought into question. And I'm half of what they're all celebrating. You're proposing that half of a marriage celebration can just waltz out? How can we be sure nobody will notice? You're adorably naive, Stan chided, shaking his head. Look, in the case of the 3 Ps, there's an unspoken truth. Nobody pays attention to the man. Xander frowned, waiting to see if his friend would clarify the obvious unknown on his own. When he didn't, Xander finally asked, The 3 Ps? Parties, porn, and pregnancies, Stan recited, already starting for the door. Xander was already following, though he wasn't sure he was invested in the idea of leaving just yet. You can't honestly expect me to accept that, mostly because it's bullshit. Oh? So you do pay attention to the guys in porn, Stan chuckled. Xander's face went hot with a blush, and he growled. What? No, that's not... I don't even... Relax, Crimson Shadow. Stan was still chuckling as he called upon the old nickname. Before Xander could offer up the typical, "Don't call me that" response, he added, I know that you're new to the whole humor thing, but I'd hope you'd recognize a joke when you came across one. All joking aside, Xander practically said through clenched teeth as he moved to grab Stan's shoulder, only to have it pass through as though there was nothing there. He rolled his eyes at himself. It figured. It was Stan, after all. How can I be sure nobody will notice that I'm not at my own celebration? Because I'm Stan. His voice was suddenly serious and unquestionable. Then, glancing back, he offered a knowing yet playful grin. And my will be done.